the autumn of 1692, while Salem's witch trials captivated New England, a darker, bloodier hunt unfolded in New Amsterdam, now New York City. 23 people vanished without trial record or mercy. Their story buried for centuries until recently discovered letters from the Stverent family estate revealed a conspiracy of fear, greed, and political manipulation far darker than Salem. This truth will reshape your understanding of early American history. Before diving into the tale of the Vanderburg family and the merchant conspiracy that ruined them, join our community of history enthusiasts. Subscribe and tell us where you're from in the comments. New York in 1692 was a city caught between worlds with 4,000 souls, Dutch merchants controlling the fur trade and French refugees stirring unease among English soldiers. Governor Benjamin Fletcher ruled from Fort James, but his authority felt fragile. The city was a patchwork of loyalties with a fierce religious divide and a lingering war with France. Amid this, 3 families dominated the merchant quarter: the Vanderburgs, who controlled the grain trade, the Livingstons, newly rich, and the De Peesters, old Dutch money. Cornelius Vanderburg had built his fortune on more than grain. His warehouse held mysterious barrels, and his brother Willem often returned with unexpected riches. The Vanderburgs' success sparked resentment, particularly from English merchants, who felt locked out of the city's wealth. Former Governor Thomas Dongen had even complained to London about Dutch influence undermining English authority. Religious tension added to the strain, with Dutch Reformed services held in Dutch, while the English Anglican congregation worshipped across town. Into this volatile mix came the first whispers of witchcraft. In October, an early frost hit Manhattan as the merchant ship Vrouwe Margaretha arrived. Its mast shattered and crew decimated. Captain Jan Kaman brought chilling news the French had surrounded Albany and Dutch farm families along the Hudson had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only empty homes and wandering livestock. This eerie event set the stage for what would follow as Cornelius Vanderburg awaited a shipment of furs and grain that had been delayed for weeks. Cornelius Vanderburg's warehouse stood nearly empty, his creditors growing impatient. His brother Willem had ridden north 2 weeks prior to investigate their delayed cargo, but no word had come back. Margaretha Vanderburg, Cornelius's wife, had taken to watching the road from the Bowery Farms every evening, hoping for any sign of Willem's return. A practical woman who'd endured the English conquest and yellow fever, Margaretha wasn't one to fret. But the empty roads had set her nerves on edge. On the morning of October 15th, as fog thickened over the East River, Margaretha went to the Dutch Reformed Church for prayers. The heavy oak doors were ajar, and inside young Anna Ketlis, the minister's daughter, knelt at the altar muttering in Dutch. Her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white, and her words sent chills down Margaretha's spine. The devil walks among us. The blood of the innocent cries out. They come tonight. Margaretha approached, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. Child, what troubles you? Anna looked up, and Margaretha recoiled. The young girl's face was pale eyes, sunken lips cracked from biting. But it was the terror in her eyes that froze Margaretha. Mevolra Vanderburg, Anna whispered, gripping her wrist with unexpected strength. They told me to warn you. Your husband must not open the warehouse tonight. The barrels. Something is wrong. Before Margaretha could ask, more footsteps echoed at the entrance. Reverend Ba appeared, followed by 2 men, Captain John Lawrence of the Colonial Militia and Magistrate Richard Townley. Townley's voice was formal. Mao Vanderburg, we need to speak with you about your brother-in-law, Willem. The question Margaretha had feared most formed on her lips. He's dead, isn't he? We found him 3 days ago, 20 miles north, near Klavik, Captain Lawrence replied. But that's not the strange part. What we found in his saddlebags. On Townley's desk lay the evidence, a human skull with strange scratches. A vial of blood still liquid despite the cold, and a map detailing every English farmstead along the Hudson, with notes on inhabitants' livestock and grain. Intelligence for the French, Captain Lawrence explained. William had been found with his throat cut, his body arranged in a ritualistic manner facing north toward French territory. The Mohawks who found him refused to touch the body, muttering words the interpreter translated as marked by the Shadow Walker. Your brother-in-law was trafficking with the enemy, Townley declared, his eyes cold. The question now is how deep this conspiracy runs. Margarita's mind reeled. Willem, a French spy. The man who'd raged against the massacre at Schenectady and personally funded weapons for the Albany militia. It didn't make sense unless someone wanted it to look that way. There must be some mistake, she said carefully. Willem was loyal to the English crown. Perhaps, Townley replied. But loyalty can be complicated among your people, especially when French gold is involved. The unspoken threat hung in the air. Your people, the Dutch, who were never quite trusted. Reverend Ba spoke for the first time, his voice thick with concern. Magistrate, surely you cannot suspect the Vanderburgs based on such unclear evidence. This family has long been pillars of our community. Townley interrupted sharply. We've received reports about your Wednesday evening gatherings, prayers in foreign tongues congregation members who seem unusually informed about military movements and collections of money for unnamed charitable causes. Perhaps it's time we examine the pillars of your community more closely. That evening, as news of Willem's death spread through the Dutch quarter, panic set in. Families who had peacefully coexisted with their English neighbors for years now scrutinized every suspicious glance, every overheard conversation, every minor slight that might be reinterpreted as evidence of sedition. Cornelius Vanderburg paced his warehouse, rechecking the inventory that had suddenly become the colony's focus. The barrels that young Anna had warned him about stood in neat rows along the east wall, grain shipments from upriver farms that should have been routine. But 3 barrels felt wrong when he knocked on them too light, as if they were only half full. When he pried open the first barrel, a foul stench filled the air, making him gag. It wasn't grain, something organic rotting. In the dim light of his whale oil lamp, he could make out human hair floating in dark liquid. His hands trembled as he opened the second barrel. More hair, more stench, and fragments of cloth blue wool, like that worn by Dutch farm wives. The third barrel contained the worst discovery, a child's wooden toy. A carved horse worn smooth by small hands floating in the same foul liquid. Someone had used his warehouse to hide evidence of the missing farm families. He was now an unwitting accomplice to mass murder. Tomorrow, when Magistrate Townley arrived with his search party, Cornelius would be found with barrels full of human remains and no explanation that wouldn't sound like the desperate lies of a guilty man. As he stood there in the lamplight, staring at the damning evidence, he heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. He extinguished his lamp and pressed himself against the wall, listening. The footsteps stopped directly outside. Then came the scraping of fingernails against wood, tracing a pattern he couldn't see but felt in his bones. The scratching lasted for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. When Cornelius finally worked up the courage to crack open the door, the street was empty, but carved into the wooden door frame was a symbol he had seen before, the same one on the skull found in his dead brother's saddlebags. At dawn, Magistrate Townley and a company of English soldiers arrived at Stone Street, their boots ringing against the cobblestones like hammer blows. Word had already spread through the Dutch quarter the Vanderburg warehouse was to be searched. Cornelius had spent the night moving the damning barrels to his cellar and scrubbing the floor with lye and sand. But evidence has a way of lingering, and the faint but unmistakable smell still hung in the air. Captain Lawrence noticed it immediately. "What cargo have you been storing here, Vanderberg?" he demanded, his sword resting casually on his pommel. Cornelius, though fear gnawed at him, replied with steady composure. "Grain, wheat and barley from the Hudson River farms. The same as always. The same farms where families have been disappearing," Townley muttered. "How convenient," as the search continued. They found the scratched symbol on the door frame, copied it onto parchment, and noted the strange odor in the warehouse. They discovered the crowbar Cornelius had left beside the empty barrel spaces, still carrying traces of the tarry substance he had found inside. But the barrels themselves were nowhere to be found. That would change when young Anna Ketlis began having her visions in public, starting during Sunday service 2 days after the warehouse search. As Reverend Ba preached, Anna suddenly stood, her eyes wide and unfocused, speaking in an unnaturally clear whisper that echoed through the sanctuary. "I see them," she said in Dutch. "Under the stone, under the house with the stepped gable. They're calling for justice. They're calling for blood." The congregation froze as Anna's voice grew stronger, describing in chilling detail the locations of human remains hidden throughout the city. She spoke of barrels in cellars, bones buried beneath gardens, children's clothing hidden in root cellars from the Bowery to the docks. Most damning of all, Anna described Cornelius Vanderberg's cellar in perfect detail, right down to the placement of the 3 barrels and the wooden toy horse floating in one of them. Magistrate Townley, who had been attending Anglican services at Trinity Church, arrived at the Dutch Reformed Church within the hour. By evening, Cornelius was in chains in Fort James, and his warehouse was swarming with English soldiers carrying shovels and lanterns. They found everything Anna had described exactly where she said it would be: 3 barrels full of human remains, 2 decomposed for easy identification, but bearing enough clothing and personal effects to confirm they belonged to the missing Dutch farm families. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, and impossible to deny. But Margarita Vanderberg was not a woman to accept the impossible without a fight. While her husband sat in a cell awaiting trial for mass murder and treason, she began her own investigation. Her first step was to uncover the source of Anna's visions that had led to the destruction of her family. Anna Ketlis lived with her father in a small house behind the Dutch Reformed Church, a tidy cottage that smelled of beeswax and dried herbs. When Margarita visited under the pretense of offering comfort, Reverend Ba confided in her, his face etched with worry. "She barely sleeps, and when she does, she speaks in languages I don't recognize. Words older than Dutch, older than anything I've heard in my 40 years of ministry." Margarita pressed gently. "Has she mentioned where these visions come from?" Reverend Ba's voice dropped. 3 women in dark cloaks. They tell her things, show her things. But what troubles me most, she knows things she couldn't possibly know. Details about families I've never mentioned, about events that happened before she was born. That evening, Margarita waited in the church gardens, watching as a candlelight flickered in Anna's window. Anna Ketlis sat at her desk, seemingly copying text from a book Margarita couldn't quite see. As Margarita watched from the garden, 3 figures emerged from the shadows near the cemetery and glided toward the cottage. Their movements were eerily fluid, almost as if they floated above the ground rather than walked on it. Their faces were hidden by hoods, but their posture suggested they weren't quite human, or perhaps not quite alive. Margarita pressed herself against the garden wall, heart racing as the figures passed within arm's reach. Up close, she saw that their cloaks weren't black, but dark purple, and they moved with unnerving silence, accustomed to remaining unseen. One carried a leather satchel, another a bundle that looked like scrolls, and the third most disturbingly carried a human skull. As the figures disappeared into Anna's cottage, Margarita understood with sudden clarity her family was being destroyed by something far more organized and deliberate than the supernatural visions of a teenage girl. Someone was using Anna as a weapon, feeding her information and presenting it as divine revelation. The question was, who and why? Margarita's discovery marked the beginning of her transformation from grieving wife to relentless investigator. Over the next few weeks, she built a network of informants among Dutch servants working in English households. Women who moved through the city like shadows, overhearing conversations their employers believed they couldn't understand. What she uncovered chilled her more than any supernatural explanation could. The plot against the Dutch merchant families had been brewing for months, orchestrated by a coalition of English merchants and colonial officials who saw the ongoing war with France as the perfect opportunity to seize control of New York's trade routes. Thomas Dongan, the former governor, had been corresponding with merchants in Boston and Philadelphia, sharing intelligence about Dutch shipping schedules, warehouse inventories, and family connections. The letters Margarita uncovered revealed a chilling plan. The Dutch in New York were seen not just as a commercial threat, but a moral one. Dongan had written, "Their prosperity under English rule suggests that conquest brings reward rather than submission. We must show that loyalty to the crown is the only path to security." The missing farm families hadn't been taken by French raiders or Indian war parties. They had been systematically relocated by English forces, their disappearances staged to appear as enemy action, while their property was quietly transferred to English settlers. The remains in Cornelius's warehouse were not human, but livestock bones prepared to look like human remains in the dim light of a whale oil lamp. The most disturbing revelation, however, was the identity of the three women Margarita had seen visiting Anna. They weren't supernatural beings or French agents. They were wives of prominent English merchants, Sarah Livingston, wife of the Scottish merchant Robert Livingston, Mary Phillips, whose husband Frederick controlled much of the Hudson River trade, and most shockingly, Elizabeth Fletcher, wife of Governor Benjamin Fletcher himself. These women had been using Anna as an unwitting oracle, feeding her carefully crafted information, which she believed were divine visions, then presenting them as proof of Dutch treachery. The purple cloaks, the ceremonial objects, the archaic language, all part of a carefully orchestrated plan to convince a devout teenage girl she was receiving messages from heaven. It was a brilliant scheme. Religious visions couldn't be questioned without questioning God, and Dutch families would be reluctant to challenge a girl they'd known, since childhood especially, when her father was their beloved minister. The plot was simple yet effective. Evidence would be planted, the visions would lead to its discovery, and Dutch property would be seized under the guise of confiscating traders' assets. But Margarita's investigation had taken too long, and the next phase of the conspiracy was already unfolding. On November 12th, Anna Kettles stood before a packed courtroom at Fort James, delivering the most devastating testimony of her young life. Speaking in clear, precise English, a language she rarely used in public, Anna described in vivid detail how Cornelius Vanderburg had confessed his supposed crimes to her during a private meeting at the church. He told me the French had promised him land grants in Quebec. She testified, her voice ringing out across the courtroom, where English colonists filled the benches. He said the war would be over within a year, and those who served France would be rewarded with titles and estates. He boasted of how many families he had helped relocate to French territory, and how their abandoned farms would soon be redistributed to proper Christian settlers. The testimony was devastating, both because it was so plausible and because it neatly explained away every inconsistency in the Crown's case. French agents had indeed been active in the Hudson Valley, and Dutch families had historical ties to French Huguenot refugees. Anna's account also explained why the remains were so decomposed. They had been buried months earlier, and why Cornelius had moved the barrels to his cellar, because he'd feared the authorities were closing in. Cornelius was not allowed to testify himself, as English law prohibited traitors from speaking in their own defense, fearing they might incite further sedition. His court-appointed attorney, a nervous young Englishman named Peter Warren, seemed more interested in ending the proceedings quickly than mounting a strong defense. The verdict was inevitable. Cornelius Vanderburg would hang for treason and murder within the week, and his property would be seized by the crown to be redistributed to loyal English subjects. But Margarita had one final card to play. On the morning of November 19th, as Cornelius sat in his cell composing what he believed would be his final letter to his wife, Margarita Vanderburg walked into Magistrate Townley's chambers. She carried a leather satchel that would either save her husband's life or seal her own fate. "I have evidence," she announced, placing the satchel on his desk with a thud that seemed to echo in the small room. Townley's expression suggested he found the idea of evidence from the wife of a condemned traitor more amusing than serious, but professional curiosity won out. "What sort of evidence, Mao?" Townley asked, his tone controlled but curious. "The sort that proves my husband innocent," Margarita replied, opening the satchel. "And more importantly, the sort that reveals who is really guilty." What she produced were documents that painted a very different picture of the conspiracy against the Dutch families. Letters in Thomas Dongan's handwriting outlined the relocation scheme, naming which English merchants were promised first rights to confiscated properties. Financial records showed payments made to militiamen for special services rendered during nighttime operations in the Hudson Valley. And most damning of all, a detailed schedule of vision visits to young Anna Kettles, signed by Elizabeth Fletcher herself. "Where did you obtain these materials?" Townley asked, his voice careful. "From the same place your Confederates obtained the animal bones they planted in my husband's warehouse," Margarita replied. "Though I suspect your next question will be whether these documents are genuine." She was right. The authenticity of the papers could be easily questioned, their provenance denied, their contents dismissed as the desperate fabrications of a woman whose husband faced the gallows. But Margarita had anticipated this challenge. "Anna Kettles is in my custody," she announced calmly. "I've spent the past week convincing her that her visions were not divine revelations, but carefully orchestrated deceptions. She's prepared to testify about her conversations with Mrs. Fletcher, Mrs. Livingston, and Mrs. Phillips. She can describe their homes, their clothing, their mannerisms, and most importantly, the specific information they fed her to include in her courtroom testimony." The color drained from Townley's face. A magistrate could dismiss documents as forgeries, but he couldn't easily explain away a teenage girl's detailed knowledge of private conversations she shouldn't have been able to overhear. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice tight. "My husband's freedom," Margarita replied. "The return of our confiscated property and safe passage for any Dutch family that wishes to relocate to Pennsylvania or the Jerseys. In exchange, my silence Anna's continued cooperation and the permanent disappearance of these documents." It was a devil's bargain, but Townley was trapped by the very conspiracy he'd helped orchestrate. If Anna recanted her testimony publicly, the entire case against Cornelius would collapse. Worse, her detailed knowledge of the English women's involvement would expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of colonial government. But Margarita had underestimated the ruthlessness of those with everything to lose. That evening, as she made her way home through the narrow streets of the Dutch Quarter, two men emerged from an alley near the old windmill. They didn't speak, didn't threaten, didn't demand her surrender. They simply grabbed her arms and began dragging her toward the docks, where a small boat waited in the shadows of the East River piers. Margarita fought like a woman possessed, her screams echoing off the stone walls of the warehouses where her husband had once conducted his honest business. but the streets were empty. The Dutch families had learned to stay indoors after dark, and her cries for help dissolved into the fog rolling off the harbor. The boat carried her into the dark waters past the shadowed bulk of Governor's Island, toward deeper waters, where the morning tide would carry away anything that needed to disappear. As they rode through the black water, Margarita realized she had been outmaneuvered by opponents who played by different rules, people for whom murder was just another business expense. But Margarita had made one final arrangement her captors hadn't anticipated. At dawn on November 20th, as harbor workers discovered her body floating among the pilings near Whitehall Slip, Anna Ketlis was already standing in the pulpit of the Dutch Reformed Church. The congregation gathered for morning prayers was instead met with a revelation that would shake the colony to its core. "I have sinned against you." Anna confessed, her young voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "I have been the instrument of deception, the weapon used to destroy innocent families. The visions I described in court were not sent by God, but crafted by mortal women who sought to profit from your destruction." She named names: Elizabeth Fletcher, Sarah Livingston, Mary Phillips. Anna described their meetings, their instructions, and the promises that she was serving a righteous cause by helping to expose Dutch treachery. She revealed the false testimony, the planted evidence, and the systematic campaign to seize Dutch property under the guise of wartime security. Most importantly, she produced copies of the documents Margarita had shown Magistrate Townley, copies hidden in the church before Margarita's final fatal meeting with colonial authorities. The reaction was swift and violent. By noon, Dutch families were gathering in the streets outside Fort James, demanding Cornelius's immediate release and the arrest of the English merchants who had orchestrated his frame. By evening, the crowd had swelled to include not only Dutch colonists, but also French Huguenots, German immigrants, and even some English settlers who were horrified by the conspiracy's scope. Governor Fletcher found himself facing open rebellion in his own capital, led by people who had once been among the colony's most law-abiding residents. His wife's involvement made denial impossible, and the documentary evidence was too detailed to be dismissed as forgery. But Fletcher was a political survivor, and he quickly realized his only chance to contain the crisis lay in offering a scapegoat. Thomas Dongan, the former governor, whose letters had detailed the land grab conspiracy, was arrested on charges of sedition and conspiracy against the crown. The English merchants involved in the scheme had their assets frozen pending investigation, and the colony began to turn its eyes toward accountability, with the balance of power in New York teetering on the brink of change. 3 militiamen who had helped plant evidence in Dutch warehouses were court-martialed and executed. In a ceremony designed to showcase English justice and mercy, Cornelius Vanderburg was not only freed, but publicly compensated for his wrongful imprisonment. His property was restored, and his family received a formal apology from the colonial government. It should have been a triumph of truth over conspiracy, justice over greed. But for the Dutch families who had endured the terror of 1692, the victory felt more like survival. They had learned that their prosperity, security, and even their lives could be destroyed by neighbors who smiled at them in the marketplace and plotted their downfall in private parlors. Many followed Margarita's advice and relocated to Pennsylvania, where William Penn's promise of religious tolerance seemed more trustworthy than the English assurances of equal treatment. Others remained, but withdrew from public life, conducting business through intermediaries and hiding their wealth rather than displaying it. The merchant families who stayed learned to live with a chilling truth in colonial America: justice was always conditional, security always temporary, and the price of prosperity was eternal vigilance against neighbors who might one day decide you were too successful for your own good. In the years that followed, the events of 1692 in New York became what historians now call a silenced history. It was something everyone knew about, but no one openly discussed. Official records were quietly amended or misplaced. Court documents disappeared, and the colonial government developed a remarkable reluctance to investigate complaints involving interethnic tensions. The fire that consumed New York's capital in 1911 completed what political expediency had begun, destroying most of the surviving documentation of the conspiracy. But traces remained in private letters, family diaries, and church records that survived the flames. Anna Ketlis never fully recovered from her role in the events. The young woman who had been manipulated into becoming an instrument of persecution spent the rest of her life seeking atonement. She eventually joined a Protestant community in New Jersey, dedicating herself to caring for orphans and refugees. She died in 1734, still haunted by nightmares of the three women in purple cloaks who had convinced her that serving their greed was serving God. Cornelius Vanderburg lived until 1718, but those who knew him said he was never the same after his imprisonment. He rebuilt his business, but never regained the prominence he'd once enjoyed, perhaps because he had learned that success could be mistaken for sedition by those who envied it. His descendants eventually anglicized their name to Vanderburg and slowly assimilated into English colonial society, their Dutch heritage becoming a private matter rather than a public identity. The English merchants who had orchestrated the conspiracy faced varying fates. Some fled to other colonies where their involvement remained unknown. Others adapted, finding new ways to acquire wealth and property through more conventional means. A few faced social ostracism that eventually drove them out of New York altogether. But perhaps the most chilling legacy of the 1692 witch hunt was how thoroughly it demonstrated the fragility of colonial justice. The same legal system that had been prepared to execute an innocent man based on fabricated evidence barely punished those who had orchestrated the conspiracy. The magistrates who had accepted supernatural visions as courtroom evidence became skeptical of documented proof when it implicated their peers. The lesson was clear in colonial America. Truth was whatever those in power needed it to be, and justice was a privilege reserved for the wealthy and well-connected enough to purchase it. This pattern would repeat throughout American history, Salem's witch trials being perhaps the most famous example, but hardly the only one. Every generation would find new enemies within new reasons to strip rights and property from those who had grown too successful, too different, or too trusting in the protection of the law. The Dutch families of 1692 New York learned what later generations would, that the greatest threat to freedom often comes not from foreign enemies, but from neighbors who decide that your prosperity represents their oppression. Your difference represents their danger, and your success represents their failure. In the end, the forgotten witch hunt of 1692 New York was never really about witchcraft at all. It was about the eternal human capacity for turning fear into justification, suspicion into evidence, and neighbor against neighbor, in service of the oldest motive in human history, greed disguised as righteousness. The documents discovered in the Stvarent family estate remind us that such conspiracies leave traces, but only for those brave enough to search for them and persistent enough to piece together fragments of truth from archives that those in power would prefer to keep hidden. Today, as we walk the streets of Lower Manhattan, where these events unfolded, we pass buildings that stand on foundations laid by Dutch merchants who learned too late that success without power is vulnerability, and justice without vigilance is merely another word for the mercy of those who would destroy you. The narrow cobblestone streets of Stone Street still wind through the financial district, but they no longer echo with the sound of wooden wheels on Dutch cart horses or the voices of merchants haggling in 3 languages. The stepped gable houses have long since given way to glass towers, and the East River docks, where Margarita Vanderburg met her end, now support the concrete foundations of the FDR Drive. But if you know where to look, traces remain. Church records tucked away in historical society archives. Land deeds that show sudden transfers of property in late 1692. Cemetery stones bearing Dutch names with death dates that cluster suspiciously around the autumn months when the conspiracy reached its climax. The most haunting remnant might be the basement of what was once Cornelius Vanderburg's warehouse on Stone Street, now occupied by a wine bar that caters to Wall Street executives. The original stone foundation still bears scratches that match the symbols found carved into colonial door frames throughout the financial district. The current owners assume they're decorative elements left by some long-forgotten craftsman. But anyone familiar with the documents from the Stvarent estate would recognize them as the marks used to identify properties targeted for confiscation. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how completely the conspiracy succeeded in its ultimate goal. By 1700, Dutch control of New York's merchant trade had effectively ended. English and Scottish families dominated the most profitable shipping routes, owned the largest warehouses, and controlled the credit networks that made commerce possible. The gradual dispossession of Dutch merchant families continued for decades, but it was accomplished through legal means, foreclosures, tax assessments, and licensing requirements, rather than the crude theater of manufactured witch trials. The 1692 conspiracy had taught its architects an important lesson: why resort to dramatic accusations of supernatural evil, when mundane bureaucratic harassment could achieve the same results with far less risk of exposure. More than 3 centuries later, the events of 1692, New York raised questions that extend far beyond colonial history. How many other witch hunts were actually cover stories for economic conspiracies? How often have religious fears been weaponized to mask purely material motives? And most uncomfortably, how many times have we as Americans convinced ourselves that persecution was patriotism, that theft was justice, and that conspiracy was community service? The Vanderburg family's ordeal reminds us that the most dangerous enemies of freedom are often those who cloak their ambitions in the language of security, who transform greed into righteousness, and who understand that the fastest way to destroy someone is to convince their neighbors that destruction serves the greater good. In 1692, 3 women in purple cloaks manipulated a teenage girl into believing that God wanted her to destroy innocent families. Today, the cloaks have been replaced by social media algorithms, cable news narratives, and carefully crafted political messaging. But the fundamental technique remains the same: convince people that their fears justify any action. Their suspicions constitute evidence, and their prejudices represent divine will. The documents found in the Stvarent estate offer no comfort to those who prefer sanitized histories and clearly labeled heroes. They reveal a colonial America where English justice was purchasable, religious authority was manipulable, and ordinary people could be turned into instruments of persecution by those skilled enough to play on their deepest fears. But they also reveal something else: the power of individuals who refuse to accept official narratives, who ask uncomfortable questions when everyone else prefers comfortable silence, and who risk everything to preserve truth for future generations who might have the courage to face it. Margarita Vanderburg died trying to save her husband and expose the conspiracy that threatened her community. Anna Kettles spent her life atoning for her unwitting role in persecution. Cornelius Vanderburg rebuilt his life, but never forgot the fragility of everything he had once thought secure. Their stories remind us that in any society, at any time, the difference between civilization and chaos might be nothing more than a few people's willingness to stand up and say, "This is wrong. I will not participate. I will not be silent." The forgotten witch hunt of 1692. New York was never truly forgotten. It was simply buried beneath layers of official amnesia and collective guilt. But burial is not the same as erasure. Occasionally, when the right person looks in the right place with the right questions, the truth has a way of surfacing, like Margarita's body in the East River, battered, damaged, but unmistakably real. As we reach the end of this dark chapter in American history, we are left with uncomfortable parallels to our own time. The techniques used to destroy the Dutch merchant families of 1692. Manufactured evidence, weaponized religious sentiment, and the transformation of neighbors into informants haven't disappeared. They've simply evolved. Every generation faces its own version of the three women in purple cloaks. Those who understand that fear is more powerful than fact, that suspicion spreads faster than truth, and that ordinary people can be convinced to participate in extraordinary evil if the justification is packaged correctly. The Vanderburg conspiracy succeeded because it gave people what they wanted. Simple explanations for complex problems, clear villains for ambiguous situations, and moral justification for profitable persecution. It failed only when individuals like Margarita Vanderburg refused to accept those simple explanations and insisted on pursuing uncomfortable truths. The choice between being Margarita Vanderburg or being the crowd that watched Cornelius march to what they thought would be his execution is one that every generation must make anew. It's the choice between convenient blindness and dangerous awareness, between comfortable conformity and costly resistance. In 1692, New York, most people made the safe choice. They believed what they were told to believe, suspected who they were told to suspect, and remained silent when silence served their interests. A few chose differently, and their choice made all the difference. The documents hidden in the Stvarent estate for over 3 centuries remind us that truth has a longer lifespan than those who try to bury it. Someone somewhere always preserves the evidence. Someone always asks the questions that need to be asked. Someone always refuses to let injustice be forgotten, even when forgetting would be more comfortable for everyone involved. This mystery shows us that history is not just a collection of facts, but a series of choices. Choices made by individuals who decided what they were willing to accept, what they were willing to ignore, and what they were willing to risk in defense of truth. The Dutch families of 1692, New York learned that prosperity without vigilance is vulnerability, that success without power is temporary, and that justice without courage is merely the temporary mercy of those who would destroy you. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried beneath the streets of Lower Manhattan? Have you ever wondered what other witch hunts in American history might have been? Cover stories for more mundane conspiracies? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this forgotten chapter of colonial injustice. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories about the hidden darkness in American history, subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the past, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries that blur the line between history and horror. The truth about our past is often more disturbing than any fiction, but it's truth we need to face if we want to understand how we became who we are today. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the shadows that official history prefers to keep hidden.